This is one of a series of good answers presentations, offering evidence to refute skeptical challenges to the Bible's accuracy. In an earlier lecture, we saw that, contrary to what we often hear from secular sources, the evidence from geology is consistent with a global flood like the one described in Genesis. Vast deposits of sedimentary rock all over the globe give testimony to this. Now we will tackle the question of when these deposits were made. Were they left by a flood like that of Noah, or are they evidence for many deluges over millions of years? We begin with the record of the rocks, and a slide that displays the hard facts of those rocks. When we examine the sedimentary layers around the earth, we find, as Ken Ham of Answers in Genesis likes to say, billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water, all over the earth. This much is undisputed fact. No matter who is studying the question, creationists or secularists, Christians or atheists, believers in an old earth or a young earth, these data are the starting point. No one denies that this is what the rocks show us. Where different observers part company is in the interpretation of this evidence. Under what conditions were these deposits laid down? And over how long a time? Was it all part of a single watery catastrophe? Or does it tell us of dozens or even hundreds of floods separated by many centuries? That is what is disputed, and that is what we will try to answer. We all know the interpretation of secular geology because we all learned it in school. Here is a typical statement of the view. For thousands, even millions of years, little pieces of our earth have been eroded, broken down and worn away by wind and water. These little bits of our earth are washed downstream, where they settle to the bottom of the rivers, lakes, and oceans. Layer after layer of eroded earth is deposited on top of each. These layers are pressed down more and more through time, until the bottom layers slowly turn into rock. So then, would whoever wrote that narrative agree with our starting point slide? Of course. Billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth. They would only add one line, over millions of years. But that's where we would disagree. Not millions of years, only a few thousand years. How can I say that? Not just because of the Bible's account. Genesis does seem to allow only a few thousand years since the creation. The rocks themselves tell us this. And we don't have to go around the world to find our evidence. We don't have to go any farther than Sideling Hill in Maryland. For people on the eastern seaboard, it's not hard to get there. It's up in that narrow western stretch of Maryland. Just take I-70 out of Baltimore, then just past Hagerstown, as you get near the Pennsylvania state line, turn onto I-68. If it's a clear day, you will see, way off in the distance, a ridge with a V-shaped notch in it. That's Sideling Hill, still 20 miles away. You see, highway engineers blasted a huge cut through Sideling Ridge several years back, and now traffic breezes right through there. Here's what it looks like now. The state even built an exhibit center at the cut when it was completed. Unfortunately, the national recession required some cutbacks, and the center was closed around 2009. But I visited the place several times before that, including 2005, with my grandson. Good-looking kid, huh? But here's what you came to see. The pedestrian overpass and the walkway up to the exposed rock face give you several angles to view the cut, and this sign explains the official history of the rocks. The U-shape of the rock layers, called a syncline, demonstrates the intense compression which folded these rocks about 240 million years ago. Subsequent erosion has shaped Sideling Hill into its present form because the white sandstone layer at the top of the ridge has resisted erosion. A large mural inside the now closed center makes this explanation a little clearer. There we see a cross-section of the syncline, as it would have been before erosion gave the landscape its present form. The green line there shows the present surface of the ground, after earth and rock had been eroded away on both left and right, to leave the ridge as we see it today. It takes a little imagination to grasp this, since the present ridge has the exact opposite profile of the rock layers under it. And that's why people stop here to stare at the rather unexpected smiley face appearance of those rock layers. Let's step through the events as we are told they happened. First, in the long ago, a flood of water flowed through here. As the flowing water slowed, the sediment it was carrying gradually settled out, and eventually the flood passed, leaving a layer of muck behind. Think of all those after-flood pictures you've seen. Thousands of years then go by. Oh, so slowly, the sediment dries out and begins to harden into rock. Then, many years later, another flood occurs. More sediment settles out, and then that flood too passes. The sequence continues as more thousands of years elapse while we see another layer of rock form. And so on, and so on. Age after age, the cycle continues. Finally, we have layer after layer of sedimentary rock. Then it gets interesting. At some point, immense pressures form in the Earth's crust and exert force on those rock layers, and the rocks are bent more and more until they assume the shape that geologists call a syncline. And that's the source of the smileys we see on the Sideling Hill highway cut. That's the official story, but it has real problems. First, for all those layers of rock to be bent at the same time seems really hard, doesn't it? We might wonder whether they could have been bent one at a time. Certainly seems easier, doesn't it? But there is a good reason why geologists don't favor that idea. Suppose after that first stage of their scenario, you have just one layer of sedimentary rock, and at that time there come some earthquake-type forces to squeeze and bend it. Then you would have this form. What would happen next? When another flood, centuries later, deposits more silt and debris, how will it be deposited? Well, water seeks its own level. Everybody knows that. So the water surface will be flat, and what sinks to the bottom will come out looking like this. So you will never get multiple layers of rock, all of more or less uniform thickness, such as we see here. That's why the geologists don't use that explanation. We all know that it couldn't produce what we see here with our own eyes. So then, back to the official story. Over millions of years, multiple floods with long ages in between them produce multiple strata of rock. And then huge horizontal forces squeeze the whole layer cake into a syncline that we observe. Well, that scenario has two major problems. Problem one. We're dealing with rock here, not Play-Doh, not even wood. Rock. Hard and brittle stuff. Given enough stress, it can flex a little. Bending it will be a real problem, and we'll return to that in a moment. But let's say for now that you can. There's a second big problem, because it's also true that sedimentary rock most certainly won't stretch. So even if this whole stack of rock layers were bent in this way, so that the top layers would be squeezed together, the bottom layers would be stretched far past their breaking point. Huge fissures would be opened up as the bottom layers were basically pulled apart. Had that been what happened here, there would be cracks in these lower layers big enough to drive trucks through them. And yet, there are no cracks at all. The layers are unbroken. And that's simply impossible. Rock won't stretch. Now let's return to that first problem. Not only will rock not stretch, it won't bend more than a tiny fraction before cracking or crumbling. Here's a view of the cut with annotations by a structural engineer. It's the business of such people to know the physical features of various substances, including rock. They're consulted when we want to sink pilings for bridge piers, or when we plan to build a 100-story tower. They have to know what kinds of stresses a given kind of rock can take before it fails. Otherwise, the bridge goes down, or the skyscraper collapses. What's an engineer's verdict about bending these rock layers? Their math and their tests tell them that these rock layers at Sideling Hill have been bent 10 times more than their physical characteristics will permit without fracturing. Not twice more, 10 times more. The judgment of a mechanical engineer? In short, sediment solidified into rock could not be shaped in this way. It's physically impossible. What can the secular geologist say to this? The best they can offer is, well, it can't be done in a lab, but over time, over millions of years, very gradual changes can do it. That's the standard appeal of evolutionary theory too, by the way. We never see any of the changes in plants or animals that theory claims, such as bacteria into baboons, or salamanders into sheep, or, most importantly, non-life into life. But over millions of years, they say, anything is possible. George Wald, a respected evolutionist and Nobel Prize laureate, famously said as much a few years ago, quote, "Time is the hero of the plot. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible, the possible becomes probable, and the probable becomes virtually certain. One has only to wait. Time itself performs miracles." Yes, the time argument is trotted out by those who believe in the evolution of plants or animals, and the geologists like it too. But it won't help them with trying to get those rocks bent. Impossible in the lab, but possible over long ages? Who says? After all, it's easy to claim something that can't be tested. Every lab test, every physical study we can do, says rock can't be reshaped in this way. And to claim that more time would change the laws of physics is a pretty desperate way to hold on to your story. We have no reason to believe that, given enough time, rock can be made to do what we know is impossible for it. But in the interest of fairness, we should acknowledge that it is possible to reshape these sedimentary rocks. A standard chart of the three rock types, igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic, will show this. Here's sedimentary rock at the bottom. Given tremendous heat and pressure, it can indeed be reshaped. And there is a name for rock that has had that reshaping done to it. It's called metamorphic rock. Rocks like granite are the result of such titanic heat and pressure. But did you catch the key fact here? It's no longer sedimentary rock. It's the third kind of rock now. And how about our test case here at Sideling Hill? Have these rocks become metamorphic? Nope. They are still good old sedimentary rock, just shaped into impossible forms. Well, what now? Sounds like we have just concluded that what we see right here before us is a physical impossibility. You can't reshape sedimentary rock and have it still be sedimentary. But the rocks are here. How could they have gotten into this impossible shape? There is a way, and only one way. If all of these strata were laid down within a short time, months or a few years, and those great squeezing forces were applied to them while they were still soft and pliable, then of course they would be bent like this. In that case, we are talking about something more like Play-Doh. Then we could have this result, but only if the whole process happened within, at most, a few years. The flood of Noah, with all the devastation it produced, could easily have laid down these multiple layers of debris, and pressures within the earth's crust, in the months and years immediately following the flood, could have reshaped them, all of them together, while they were still soft. But in that case, when we visit Sideling Hill, we aren't looking at 240 million years of Earth history. We can't be. The only way this could have happened is with a massive flood that left multiple layers of debris that were then reshaped by Earth movements before they could harden into rock. In a word, no millions of years for Sideling Hill. And what's more, Sideling Hill is not some one-of-a-kind fluke of geology. Far from it. We can find bending and folding of sedimentary rock layers all over the place. Here's the Tapeats sandstone of Grand Canyon. The red line shows us how much these layers were distorted, all without cracking or crumbling. And if we decide to tour around the world, we can see example after example of these formations. Sedimentary rock, brittle and impossible to bend more than an infinitesimal amount, that has been bent and twisted into all kinds of bizarre shapes, all without fracturing. All done, like Sideling Hill, in the only way possible, while those multiple layers of sediment were still soft and pliable, while not yet hardened. We come back then to where we began, to the facts that everyone acknowledges. Billions of dead things, buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth. The secular geologists would like to add the line, over millions of years. But that's the wrong line. What we need to add is, and all at one time. Sideling Hill and countless other sites all over the globe provide us with that answer. The only explanation that fits the facts is the one the Bible provides. Noah's flood, just 4,500 years ago. Not only do we not need those millions of years, there's just no room for them. The flood explains it all. If you have questions about this lecture or any others in the Good Answers series, you may direct them to me, Dr. Jerry C. Four, at yahoo.com.